CA Nipun Mehta ji, respected Vice Chairman of the CIRC, CA Atul Agarwal ji, my dear friend and Regional Council Member CA Churchill Jain ji, and the viewers of this virtual meeting. This is the 6th day of 9-day series of virtual meeting on capital market and crypto Outlook 2022. A very good evening to all of you. So since we have with us Churchill Jain ji, Regional Council Member, so I request him for his opening remarks. Over to you, Churchill ji.
Thank you, Devendra Kumar ji. Respected Mehta साहब, हमारे वाइस चेयरमैन CIRC अतुल अग्रवाल जी, रीजनल काउंसिल मेंबर एंड पास्ट चेयरमैन CIRC देवेंद्र सोमानी जी, in absence of present CIRC चेयरमैन नीलेश गुप्ता जी, and respected members, आप सभी का इस कॉन्फ्रेंस में हार्दिक स्वागत है। जैसा कि देवेंद्र सोमानी जी ने बताया कि क्रिप्टो करेंसी और आउटलुक ऑफ मार्केट दोनों जो टॉपिक लिए कैपिटल मार्केट के, वो वास्तव में जो रिलेटेड टॉपिक है चार्टर्ड अकाउंटेंट से बिल्कुल जुड़े हुए हैं। और मैं बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद देना चाहता हूँ CIRC चेयरमैन को कि उन्होंने ये सीरीज बनाई और सभी मेंबर्स को लाभान्वित होने का मौका उन्होंने दिया। जैसा कि कैपिटल आउटलुक 2022 के लिए बात की जा रही है, तो ये जो आज सिनेरियो हम मार्केट में देख रहे हैं वो बड़ा ही पॉजिटिव सेंटिमेंट्स हैं, क्योंकि जो 2021 मार्च के बाद से जो सेंटिमेंट हमारे देश में आया या मार्केट का देखा जाए तो बहुत पॉजिटिव सिनर्जी मार्केट के अंदर रही। हाईएस्ट लेवल भी मार्केट ने छुआ है, लेकिन ये भावनाओं से प्रेरित देश है। कहीं ना कहीं कोई भी सेंटिमेंट अगर बिगड़ते दिखते हैं तो कहीं ना कहीं उसका इफेक्ट मार्केट पे सबसे तेजी से मार्केट पे आता है। उसमें उस समय ना कंजम्पशन देखा जाता है, ना प्रोडक्शन देखा जाता है, ना बजट से एक्सपेक्टेशन देखी जाती है, ना उसके क्वार्टरली रिजल्ट देखे जाएंगे कंपनियों के। तो मेनली जो मार्केट का जजमेंट होता है वो या तो हमारी जितनी कैपिटल बजट से अपेक्षाएं रहती है उस पर निर्भर करती है कि साल भर का बजट क्या है, उस वो दिशा और लय मार्केट की बताते हैं कि किस तरीके से मार्केट रहने वाला है। जो कि हर क्वार्टर एंड पे कंपनी के रिजल्ट्स आते हैं, वो उनकी अर्निंग्स है, उनका प्रोडक्शन, उनकी कैपेसिटी यूटिलाइजेशन है, उसके आधार पे भी एक दिशा तय होती है कि किस दिशा में हम आगे बढ़ रहे हैं। और देखा जाए तो बहुत सारा जो इफेक्ट रहता है इंटरनेशनल ट्रांजेक्शन्स का रहता है, जैसे यूएस की फेड टेपर अनाउंसमेंट होता है, या इंटरेस्ट रेट मूवमेंट है, या रिस्क फ्रॉम ओमिक्रॉन है अभी, वो मार्केट की दिशा को तय करेंगे। साथ ही ऑयल प्राइजेस है, बॉन्ड यील्ड है, पैटर्न ऑफ द FIF मूवमेंट भी 2022 की दिशा तय करेंगे, किस तरीके से वो कार्य कर रहे हैं हमारे साथ में। राइजिंग इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर एंड पैंडेमिक पोजीशन के अलावा कोई नया खतरा हमको बाजार में नहीं दिख रहा है। तो देखा जाए तो जिस तरीके से हम जिस दिशा में हम कार्य कर रहे हैं वो बहुत ही पॉजिटिव बाजार रहने वाला है। और बाकी एक्सपर्ट व्यू के लिए हमारे साथ निपुण मेहता जी हैं। मैं देवेंद्र कुमार सोमानी जी को धन्यवाद देना चाहता हूँ कि उन्होंने मुझे 2 शब्द कहने का मौका दिया और कुछ विचार रखने का अपॉर्चुनिटी मुझे प्रदान की। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद आपका। और मैं देवेंद्र कुमार सोमानी को बोलता हूँ आगे की कार्रवाई आप अपने अनुरूप जारी रखें। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
Thank you, my dear friend Churchill ji, for your words of wisdom. Since we have with us our learned speaker Nipun Mehta ji, so without wasting our time, I am just reading his profile, though he need not any introduction, but still it is a formality. So Mr. Nipun Mehta is a fellow member of ICI and a private equity investor, a mentor and independent director. Through his career, Mr. Mehta has held leadership position in domestic and global financial institutions. He has earned a global recognition as a global outstanding private banker, an award given to future global leaders in private banking. Known for his ability to read corporate and economic trend, he is frequently invited for his views on TV channels and by global newswire agencies. He is a popular speaker at the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, IIMs, and business schools. With these, I request Nipun Mehta sir for his deliberation. Over to you, Nipun sir.
Devendra ji, before starting his deliberation, I would like to add one thing. There is one colleague of CA Nipun Mehta ji in our group, who is one of the attendees from Kochi. So he has sent a message to you, sir. He is your mate. He was there. He might have done CA with you, or he might have worked with you. So he has sent a message to you. He is sending a wave message. So this is just, I wanted to convey to you, Anup P. Jacob is here. He is also listening your deliberation. So over to you, sir.
We have viewers across the country, even outside country.
So thank you very much, Devendra ji, for the introduction. Thank you, Atul Agarwal ji, Devendra ji, and Churchill ji for inviting me for this webinar or virtual CP meeting, as we call it. I must compliment Devendra ji for organizing such a wonderful series of talks, of webinars. As he said, this is probably the 6th one in this series, which clearly means that probably a lot as far as the capital market is concerned, as far as cryptocurrencies are concerned, has already been covered. So what we can do is maybe talk less and wait for a lot of questions. As Atulji mentioned, old friend of mine, Anup, has also joined, and he's promised me that he's going to ask extremely difficult questions. So we'll welcome all the participants for this talk, and hope it will be enlightening, it will be useful to you as we talk about the capital market outlook for 2022. So if one looks at the year 2021, or maybe even if we go to 2020 in retrospect, one can literally say that events have happened which have actually reshaped the world, and to such an extent that it's often said that this event of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, was probably event equivalent to the world wars in terms of its impact that it has had on various economies, on various businesses, and on the kind of impact it has had on retail pockets. Of course, the world wars were much longer, had a fairly deep economic impact. But if one sees how the capital market has moved, or how business profitability has changed over the last year or 18 months, the impact of COVID has probably been relatively limited or short-lived, one can say. So what basically COVID resulted in is, one can say, a fair amount of digitization of the entire economy. To the extent that today, virtually all businesses, even small businesses, have adopted digitization, whether it is digitization for their own businesses, with digitization in terms of payments, the kind of orders that we are seeing as far as the IT companies are concerned for digitization, the kind of market share and wallet share Indian companies have had, Indian IT companies have had in the global order flow that is there, has clearly been extremely positive. So the extent of digitization has been huge, partly because of work from home, partly because of the number of apps that have been developed. So really, the digitization of the economy has had several positive impacts, and we'll probably go into that a little later. But one of the key in terms of this digitization of the entire economy has clearly been what we as chartered accountants probably monitor a lot closely, and which is the extent of collections of direct taxes and indirect taxes. So we've seen consistent GST collection, which has been more than 1 lakh crores as far as the government is concerned. We've seen direct taxes collection for the December quarter, which was probably a huge jump when you look at it on a YOY basis. We've seen record collections from corporates, record collection from individuals. A lot of individuals probably also paying taxes out of profit because of profits and short-term and long-term capital gains they made out of the capital market. So one has seen a fair amount of benefit that has come out of this kind of digitization. In fact, when we talk of apps, you probably now talk of fintech apps. You have edtech apps. You have pharma tech or farm tech apps. You have probably agri-tech apps. So all kinds of tech apps that one can think of, and which are clearly helping businesses grow. Food tech is something that I again forgot, and how can one forget the Swiggies and Zomatos of this world? So the extent of advertising that one has seen, the extent of growth of some of these businesses that we have seen has been huge as far as the tech business is concerned. Of course, there is a huge amount of difference that of whatever happened in terms of quantitative easing. So clearly the market growth, as all of us know, has been because of liquidity, whether it is global liquidity or domestic liquidity. Domestic liquidity coming out of higher savings, lower spends. So people spent less on travels, people spent less on entertainment. So clearly there were savings. Money was made on a huge amount on the capital markets. So profits were on capital markets. So there, the newer generation which spends less on hard assets like or physical assets like real estate or gold probably also is another reason why they have a fair amount of higher savings. So you've seen a huge amount of liquidity coming into the markets. The figures for the number of record number of individuals registered by the stock exchanges is for all of us to see. But I think clearly the liquidity flow, when one compares this with the liquidity flows that happened in 2008 and what happened in 2020 in terms of quantitative easing that a lot of the governments have had, is that in 2008, one had a lot of the funding that happened straight from the central banks onto a lot of businesses, onto a lot of banks. The banks in turn pumped that into the economy, and as and when quantitative easing was reversed, a lot of those bonds that had been issued to banks, they started being bought back, and there was reverse liquidity that happened, and quantitative easing was when quantitative easing was reversed. What has happened this time, in comparison, particularly in the US, is a lot of that fund infusion has been directly into the hands of individuals. As we saw early in the pandemic, there was a huge amount of liquidity that individuals got when the Fed started pumping in close to $600 if you're an individual, $1,200 if you're a family. There was a fair amount of money directly into the hands of individuals. So all of that liquidity which came in terms of individual spend, not just investing into the capital markets, but also individual spend that was there. A lot of the leveraged individuals that were there who used to spend on credit cards started repaying their credit cards. So banks were flush with liquidity. So the liquidity flow that was there for the global markets have clearly ensured that this kind of market run is something that probably would sustain for some time. The difference as far as India is concerned is that there wasn't that kind of infusion of pure liquidity, simple liquidity by Reserve Bank of India. the government probably used alternate methods, or Reserve Bank used alternate methods to ensure that the economy was propped up in terms of providing food grains, or the extent of liquidity that was infused within the economy was very measured and controlled. So if one compares the kind of inflation that, let's say, US has had in comparison to what India has had, it's been a lot more controlled. So there's essentially a big difference in terms of the extent of liquidity that or quantitative easing that happened. I think this time around, most central banks are a lot more conscious about reversing quantitative easing, and that's where you're going to really see a big difference in terms of the pace with which interest rates are increased, or what's the extent of stoppage of bond buying that globally that one is likely to see. It might not be as fast. We all know it's not been as sudden as it was in 2011-12. So this time probably it might not result in the kind of a shock impact that stock markets or to that extent a lot of economies had in 2008. When one looks at the overall macros within the economy, I think we've had very positive macros over the last few quarters now. Clearly, what's helped is increased collection of taxes. The government has been spending quite a bit as far as infrastructure is concerned, and even as far as the funding of a lot of these schemes that came out, whether it was a PLI scheme, whether it was a food grains distribution scheme, a lot of that, despite a lot of that, the deficit that we potentially could have seen in the economy is relatively controlled. So that's as far as that's a positive as far as domestic macros are concerned. You have fiscal deficit which hasn't gone out of control, which also means that the government is in a position to spend that much more on infrastructure, and that's what you're actually seeing the government consistently doing over the last year or 2 years. In fact, a few years back, 4 or 5 years back, the kind of spending that is being done in infrastructure was considered large. But what one has seen in the last 2 years is probably is significantly larger, and the impact that it's likely to have on the Indian economy, obviously, to that extent, much better. When one looks at the last 1 year or 2021 in terms of the serious positives, I would think, and not enough probably has been said on the contribution of the two regulators, and one is the Reserve Bank of India and the other is SEBI. I think their positive contribution has ensured that there has been no disruption as far as markets are concerned. I mean, think back, whenever markets have had this kind of a sharp volatile movement in, let's say, of the type in 2020, when in a matter of not weeks, but a few days, the markets virtually collapsed. Stocks were at half their value, in many cases even lower. And still, we did not have a capital market crisis in terms of payments or in terms of investors or brokers going belly up. So I think the extent of control that SEBI exercised at that point in time, the monitoring that was done, the kind of monitoring that SEBI has been constantly doing as far as insider trading is concerned, pulling up a lot of traders, promoters for insider trading, the kind of margining system that SEBI has introduced, all of that, I think, is something that's extremely positive as far as SEBI is concerned. Even as far as when one looks at it from the IPO point of view, and I think that's one thing that probably deserves a lot more time in terms of discussion. One has seen a spate of IPOs, or let me come to IPOs. Let me finish on SEBI and RBI. But the kind of measures introduced by SEBI at different points in time, whether it is related to IPOs, mutual funds, margining on derivatives on cash markets, I think all of that has been commendable. Really ensured that there was a lot more smoother functioning of the markets despite the extent of volatility that was there. Again, when one looks at RBI, probably there are a lot of central governors of a lot of central banks worldwide, which actually look at Fed as much as, or look at RBI, what RBI is doing as much as what they look at Fed is doing, or the Federal Reserve is doing. I think RBI again, in terms of the fund infusion or liquidity infusion in the market, has been very measured. The control or the focus on inflation in the initial part was significant, was important, and helped in ensuring that there wasn't, the inflation didn't go out of control. And obviously, to that extent, interest rates could be measured and monitored. And we haven't seen any knee-jerk reactions coming out of the central bank. But I think the extent of control of volatility as far as the currency is also concerned is something that RBI has done a commendable job on. We haven't seen a huge amount of sharp movement even as far as currency is concerned. There have been a lot of currencies which have significantly weakened against the dollar. There have been countries or currencies which have again seen very sharp movements in terms of devaluation against the dollar. But I think there again, Reserve Bank has played a very positive role in terms of controlling the currency movements. I think the when one talks of 2021, I think it's very important also to focus on the kind of IPOs that we've seen. We saw close to about 63 IPOs during the year, which raised about 1.2 lakh crores, which was again one of the higher figures that one has seen as far as primary market is concerned in India. Of these 63, 27%, which is about 17 IPOs, were subscribed more than 100 times. And this is something which again is a record. We've seen huge oversubscriptions that are there to such an extent that retail investors have been almost frustrated with almost limited or no allotments, that it had virtually become a lottery as far as retail investors are concerned, in the hope that they would probably get some shares. So yeah, about 17 IPOs, more than 100 times. 2 IPOs had record oversubscription more than 300 times. So 327 times has been the highest, and that's something that we saw fairly recently, about 2 months back in one of the IPOs. So there's been a fair amount of response, and that's natural. Whenever the secondary markets are high, retail investors typically participate a lot as far as the primary markets are concerned, and IPOs do get heavily oversubscribed. But the big trend change that happened because of these IPOs was equity ownership moved from private equity to public hands. And this is something which we hadn't seen before 2021. So we saw Zomato, we saw Paytm, we saw Nykaa, we saw Nazara. A lot of these IPOs that typically came by, which had earlier been funded by private equity, valuations going through the roof, really to an extent that there was a fair amount of question mark on the kind of valuation that some of these IPOs have had. But the key is, what was purely valuations in theory in the hands of private equity guys actually became sort of valuations in the public domain through a subscription by the Indian public or the Indian mutual funds, and a lot of those valuations got validated. Whether you call them outsized or valuations or whatever, some of them got validated. Time will say whether a lot of these valuations will continue or so. There are obviously a lot of question marks on the kind of valuations some of these so-called unicorns have got. We've even seen, in fact, why this is also very important is because in 2022, because of the success of some of these IPOs in 2021, you're likely to see a spate of further IPOs that would come by in 2022. Like I said, it could be edtech, food tech, fintech, pharma tech. It could be, we haven't seen any on agri-tech, but probably something on agri-tech as well, something that we might see. But when one talks of valuations, probably, and particularly unicorn kind of valuations, for those who might be watching the private equity market, valuations have been, one can almost say they've gone haywire. We have a company to such an extent that we have a company which advertises very frequently on television, which for March 20 had a revenue of about 52 lakhs and is today valued at $4 billion, which is about 30,000 crores. Revenue of 52 lakhs for March 2020. There's another company, again, which advertises very frequently on television, particularly during cricket matches. So one can imagine the kind of costs that they are incurring. March 20 valuations of 1 crore, the current valuation of $3 billion, so about 22,500 crores. So these are the kind of, forget the profitability. One doesn't even need to talk about profitability. The losses will be to an extent of 500 to 700 crores in either of these cases. So really, the kind of valuations that some of these unicorns have seen, probably out of whack completely. But one should also keep in mind that some of these companies are expected to grow significantly, and one should not be surprised where if 5 years from now, there are a few of these companies which are even on the index, whether you, if not on Sensex, at least on the Nifty index, you might see them. So you already see something like Byju's, which has already touched valuations which are more than some of the index-based companies. So I think watching some of these startups is something that's going to be key as far as 2022 is concerned. But when one sees the kind of capital market growth again, and 2021 returns of about 22% on the Nifty was still probably was positive as far as the indices were concerned. The large cap indices were concerned. The mid caps gave even better, which was higher at about closer to 50-52%. The small caps gave even better than that. So the kind of returns that investors have made on both large, on all three of them, large, mid, and small caps, virtually all across, has been huge. To an extent that if one looks at Sensex companies, of the 30 companies, we have, as of today, just about 2 companies which are below 1 lakh crores of market cap. If one goes back to pre-COVID, this number was less than half, or during the at the time when COVID probably started, we had less than half of this number, which were above 1 lakh crores. So we've seen huge valuation gains that have happened, not just in India, across the world. All of us know now Apple is the first company which has touched $3 trillion of market cap. And mind you, that's equivalent to the GDP of India. So we've seen, as of now, there are, if you look at NASDAQ, or if you look at the US market, there are 5 companies which have a market cap which is above $1 trillion. Before the pandemic, there was just one company that was above $1 trillion. So you've seen a huge gain as far as a lot of these companies are concerned. When one looks at a stock like, let's say, Apple, and some of this is very interesting, are very interesting data points. When one looks at Apple, which is at around $174, and all of us in India have really, when one looks at the paid up value or par value of shares, we are generally of the, or you go back several years, it used to be 100 rupees or 10 rupees. In 95, SEBI changed that and made it open for companies to have lower par value or lower paid up value of shares. That's why we've seen a number of splits that come about. And now we also have shares which are several several companies, in fact, which have a par value or paid up value of 1 rupee. In the US, this concept obviously has been much older. And if one looks at the par value, as they call it, of a stock like Apple, what one has, what in India, what we have as 1 rupee, as the lowest common denominator as far as paid up value is concerned. In US, there is no lower amount that you can have, and the number of splits, like something like a stock like Apple has had, has ensured that its paid up value is 0.4 zeros and 1. So it's the fifth decimal that's the paid up value. And if this surprises you, you must look at the paid up value of Microsoft. Microsoft, which is at about about $315 or thereabouts, has a par value of 0.50625. So, 1 पैसे का 10,000 नहीं, 1 lakh portion का 1 lakh decimal है. That's the kind of paid up value that some of these stocks have got. So the number of splits that they have gone through have been so huge that have been so many that we typically see 1:1, 1:1, 1:2, 1:5 split that happens in India. Apple has had 1:7 split some time back, and of course it has had several more. But yeah, that's the kind of data point which for us in the field of numbers makes it somewhat interesting to follow. On the other hand, you have companies like Berkshire Hathaway, which has Series A, which is at $467,000 as the price of 1 share, which is the paid up value of $5. So really, in sharp contrast, one has seen companies grow significantly in market capitalization in India, globally. What's also happened over the last year or so is that a lot of companies have had a huge amount of cost rationalization. So whether it was work from home, whether it was lower costs incurred for travel, entertainment, all of that started showing clearly as far as the bottom line was concerned. So you had a huge amount of profit jump that typically came about for a lot of these companies. Debt restructuring, not just debt restructuring for weak companies, but when you look at stronger companies or companies which had a fair amount of debt on their books, because of all this higher profitability, they could repay a lot of debt. Balance sheets became much stronger. Whether it's not just banking, it was you could see it all across old economy, new economy, all of these sectors that was there. So profitability increased to an extent that balance sheets became much stronger. Interest costs were much lower. Funds were raised at significantly lower interest rate because we were at almost multi-decade low interest rates. A lot of companies used that as an opportunity to raise funds from the debt market, from the bond market. A lot of them also, because the higher valuations or rich valuations as far as the stock markets were concerned, raised a fair amount of money at fairly high premiums in order to repay either a lot of debt and or for further expansion. So really, a lot of the debt got cleaned up, and that's something which was very positive as far as a lot of companies are concerned. There were a lot of smart strategies also that some of these companies adopted, and I'd like to point one or two, which probably only indicates the extent of smart management that some of these companies keep doing. So if one goes back to, say, 2020, one remembers a time when oil prices crashed to such an extent that crude oil for a day or for 2 days was in the negative. It was minus $35. So you actually were paid if you bought crude oil. Now, some of you might know that for paint companies, the crude oil price movement becomes key because one of the key raw materials is a derivative of oil. So at a time when the crude price collapsed in mid or in April 2020, one of these companies, and all these paint companies use turpentine. One of these companies actually bought, you typically have maybe a few weeks of stock which you use for manufacturing of paint. In best of times, you can go a few weeks into having the stock. This company went ahead and bought a few months of stock as far as turpentine was concerned. So what happened clearly was that they got their raw material at such a low price that the manufacturing cost virtually crashed. So when you have such a low manufacturing cost and you go ahead and manufacture much larger quantity than you typically, or let's say the next 3 months sales or 4 months sales is something that you go ahead and manufacture and just virtually carpet bomb all the shelves of all distributors at a much larger margin or much larger commission to a lot of these distributors. Clearly, you're going to capture shelf space. And the moment you've captured shelf space, the distributor first has to sell your stock, and as a result, what happens is the company gains market share. So some of these companies have played very interesting strategies in order to ensure that market share during the pandemic. They actually gained during the pandemic. The benefit clearly showed up as far as profitability is concerned. When you look at it on a quarter-on-quarter basis or year-on-year basis, that impact you're likely to see in the sense that probably a year back, that profitability because of all these incidents, events, or strategies was significantly higher. But clearly, I think very intelligent strategies on cost rationalization, on fundraising, on debt repayment, on raw material costing, and a lot of that was something that we clearly saw as far as a lot of companies were concerned. And that's really showed up or is showing up very positively as far as profitability is concerned. So you've seen corporate earnings really, when you look at it on a year-on-year basis, between 2013 or 2014 and 2019 or 2013 and 2019, there had been just about a 3.5% corporate earnings growth that one had seen CAGR. What one has seen over the last 2 years or so is a lot of covering up of the lost ground. What's expected for March 22 and March 23 is almost a 20% growth in corporate earnings. That's something which becomes a huge booster, not just in terms of profitability, but in the extent of further capex that a lot of these companies can have. So a big positive as far as the potential capex is concerned, as far as companies, the ability of companies to raise funds is concerned. So again, extremely positive as far as the corporate sector is concerned. So when one looks at all of these factors, I think it's a lot more positive as a scenario that one sees on for 2022. I think as when Churchill Jain was he was talking initially, he did mention how profitability for a lot of corporates has increased. I think that's what's happened is there's been a huge turnaround even for a lot of loss-making industries and loss-making sectors. So when one looks at, let's say, something like real estate, when one looks at maybe sugar, there's been not just a huge turnaround through much lower inventory. So if you look at real estate, what 2 years back showed up as almost 4 years of inventory, unsold inventory in a lot of cities, it could be in whatever, Bombay, Chennai, Delhi. There was almost 4 years of unsold inventory that was there. Now, as you see, not just has a lot of that inventory got sold, you have much lower unsold inventory left. It's just about 1 year in a lot of cities like, let's say, Bangalore or Pune or Hyderabad, which is significantly lower than what it was 2 years back. Even in larger cities in Mumbai or Delhi or Chennai, it's just about 2 years of inventory that is there. Not too many newer projects have been launched, which also has ensured that the inventory levels are more in control. But the most significant part was the losses that a lot of these real estate companies were incurring got converted into profits. You've seen repayment again, the same story as far as real estate is concerned, repayment of a lot of debt, people taking benefit of lower interest rates, and the housing industry getting benefit of that. As a result, a lot of the ancillary industries to housing have also benefited, whether it is paints or tiles or broadly cement and steel, which goes in as raw material. So clearly a lot of benefits that come about through one particular sector or showing improved profitability is actually showing up into a ripple effect that comes about across various sectors. So that's a positive again, as far as real estate was concerned, when they sort of turned around from loss making to profit making. There were other sectors as well, similar, which probably had a lot more government control, or which had gone sort of down under. Infrastructure was one of that, where there had been a lot of infrastructure spending in 2014-15, but it really didn't get converted into these infrastructure companies benefiting a lot, or the growth of infrastructure didn't really happen to the extent it should have had, given the kind of spending that the government had. As opposed to that, now, if you see, there's been a huge change, and you are seeing earlier there was the PPP model that was there, that was changed. You had for infrastructure what is called as a HAM model, hybrid annuity model, that came about. Availability of land became a lot easier as far as the state governments or central governments are concerned. That ensured that infrastructure projects were a lot smoother to launch, or a lot smoother to execute, and then to complete. That ensured that at some point in time, when government was one of the largest creditors as far as the infrastructure industry is concerned, that changed, that turned around, and a lot of these guys were paid off. That ensured that you had a much lower debt as far as infrastructure companies are concerned. So I think a lot of positives coming out of what we've seen over the last year or so across various industries, and one can go on sector by sector and really highlight the kind of benefit that each of these sectors have had. You can talk about metals, which have benefited out of significantly out of change of sort of demand as far as China is concerned, stoppage of or control of production facilities as far as steel is concerned within China. In fact, to an extent that China, which has been contributing to about a third of global growth prior to COVID, that growth has fallen to a quarter of contribution. 25% of the global growth is now contributed by China. So there's been slowdown as far as China is concerned, and to that extent, a lot of Indian companies, not just out of a China plus one scenario, but also out of the kind of opportunities that a lot of the manufacturers, a lot of the Indian entrepreneurs took, is something which probably again is extremely commendable. Add to that the kind of support that through PLI schemes and a lot of the others that the government would give some of these manufacturers, Indian companies which had a significantly lower share of exports. If you look at the exports figure again for November, for December, huge jump again. in terms of the overall exports, again, across industries. You could include textiles, it could be auto ancillaries, IT exports is obviously the largest contributor that is there. So you've seen a lot of companies significantly raising their export capabilities, and that shows up again in a much lower current account deficit that is there. So when one has seen significant rise in exports, companies have taken benefit not just of a scenario where a lot of the manufacturers in Europe wanted an alternative supplier, and Indian companies stepped up, ensured that they could export a lot to a lot of these European companies. So there was a huge leg up as far as the Indian manufacturing sector is concerned. So you've seen that again as a huge positive, very opportunistic benefit that a lot of these Indian companies took, Indian manufacturers took. So in view of this kind of scenario, how does one look at 2022? So obviously a lot of pointers of whatever has happened in 2021 leads to a fair amount of optimism as far as 2022 is concerned. One could see reasonable, closer to 18 to 20% corporate earnings growth that could be there, which is again reflecting as far as the indices, the stock markets are concerned, the stock prices are concerned. I think one needs to maybe I'll cover that as well separately, but there's one needs to be cautious about the extent of fraud that is there as far as the market is concerned. There are the kind of movement that we've seen as far as mid cap and small caps are concerned is something that one saw only way back in 2006-07, when virtually the huge outperformance was there as far as mid caps are concerned. Again, small caps ran up quite a bit, but a lot of these obviously are not backed by fundamentals. One needs to be extremely cautious when one looks at companies day after day hitting upper circuits, and ensuring that one doesn't get carried away by the greed that it might lead to. The moment you have 5, 10, 15 circuits, there are in fact companies which in a 9-month period have gone up as much as 100 not 100 but 110 times in a last. There was an IPO last April issued at about 100, and the stock price is close to 10,000. It touched 11,000 sometime back. So in a 9-month period, you've seen 100 times the price rise. So there are those kind of stocks which investors can get carried away by, but one clearly needs to look at the business model, the kind of sustainability of earnings, kind of profitable sustainability of profits that are there, which is very critical in terms of ensuring that the valuation metrics is something that one looks at very closely. So when one looks at the markets, one, like I said, looks at it with a fair amount of optimism, but one must look at also some of the risk factors that could be there, or some of the red flags that one must keep in mind. The kind of debt that's been raised in the last 1 year or last 1.5 years by central governments has been huge. The printing of currency that has happened, you have as of today about 25 countries which have debt more than 300% of their GDP. I mean, this is a huge figure. This needs to sink in. When you have debt, which is today, there are 25 countries. In 1995, there were zero companies which had debt that was as high. When you look at the kind of interest costs that some of these central governments are going to bear over the next few years, till a lot of this debt comes down, and debt typically generally never comes down very easily. But the kind of interest costs that they will incur will ensure that there's a huge amount of fiscal deficit. all of us know that the extent of contribution of interest that Indian government pays out of the overall fundraise that is there, and why it's one of the larger contributors as far as the deficit is concerned. In the same way, a lot of these larger governments or a lot of the countries which have raised this kind of debt are going to pay huge costs for that, and which will ensure a huge amount of fiscal deficit, which will probably get converted into a higher inflation that could be there. So I think the moment there's higher inflation, the central banks probably need to look at fairly closely at the interest rates. If you increase interest rates, you're going to compromise on growth. So, and that's one point which, when one was talking about the contribution by RBI, I think that's one positive step as far as RBI is concerned. The focus that had always been there for so many years on inflation has now shifted to focus on growth, and that's something which is ensuring that there is that much more profitability, that the lower interest cost that has come about. That's something that's ensuring that interest costs or interest rates remain within control. So a lot of those benefits is what Indian industry is deriving, and which a lot of the global companies might not derive, depending on the kind of inflation that's there in respective countries or the kind of pace of interest rate increase that some of these central governments have. The other critical point one needs to also look at is probably on the fact that if you go back 2 or 3 years, there were several countries which had negative interest rates. So you had close to about 8 or 9 companies, including Japan, Sweden, Switzerland, Norway, a lot of these companies which had negative interest rates, which would mean that people had to actually pay banks to keep money in the banks, and banks wanted to or had kept those negative interest rates were kept by central banks so that people would spend rather than keep money in the bank. And despite this, you have not seen turnaround as far as a lot of these European economies is concerned. Japan is a separate case. You've seen growth as far as Japan is concerned, and interest rates still haven't significantly turned around. But a lot of these European economies, despite having negative interest rates, never actually managed to turn around. So when one does have a situation where interest rates are turning, and the impact that it could have on a lot of the corporates in terms of higher interest costs on the one side, to potentially on growth of these economies could be a big question mark. So I think that's something that needs to be kept in mind when is moving from a negative interest rate to a positive interest rate scenario. China, of course, slowing down has been is a big factor as far as global growth is concerned. A lot of commodity pricing increase, whether it is metals, whether it is oil, a lot of that is something that's going to have a major say as far as costs are concerned, raw material costs are concerned for a lot of companies. We've already seen that impact in the September quarter results, where raw material costs had actually affected profitability of a lot of these companies. So as you see crude oil prices rise, or as you sustain pricing of a lot of these metals, clearly that's something that's likely to show up as far as raw material costing is concerned, and which could just impact demand to an extent. So when one looks at the fact that rural demand hasn't been very positive over the last quarter or two, when one looks at the fact that raw material costs are rising as far as a lot of these FMCG companies is concerned, and which would probably mean that they would need to increase prices. When you correlate the two, increased prices and lower rural demand that's been around, what clearly it throws up is probably there could be a sort of lack of growth or absence of the kind of growth that one has seen as far as FMCG companies are concerned. So that's something, the increase in costs is something that needs to be very clearly kept in mind when one looks at the possibility of corporate earnings and which sectors would clearly benefit. I think, as is always very normal in India, budget which is in about 3 weeks' time is something which is going to be a critical factor. It will, as is usual, lead to a fair amount of stock market volatility on the one side, but clearly, given the fact that there are 5 states which are going in for elections, there is likely to be a fair amount of focus of the finance budget on infrastructure spending, also on growth. So that's something which you're likely to see to continue. The kind of infra spending that government has had, that's something that's expected to continue. We've seen that coming in as a ripple effect on the kind of spending that happens, private sector spending that happens, and or the kind of money that's come about in the hands of the bottom of the pyramid in terms of the kind of employment that it's got generated. Clearly, the kind of ripple effect infrastructure spending creates a fair amount of employment. And our sense is that not just is the government focus likely to be on overall growth of the economy, either through largely through infrastructure spending, but also as the thought process being to create a fair amount of employment, which infrastructure is able to create. So I think that employment creation, which is also one of the key points as far as some of these state elections are concerned, is going to ensure a fair amount of government spend that comes about through the budget. So when one looks at the private sector capex that could happen as a result of all of these, that's again very that should show up gradually in positive light. We haven't seen capex to the extent one had seen way back in 2007, 2008, when you saw capital markets rise significantly. Global markets were booming. There were a lot of capex. There was a lot of capex announced. A lot of newer projects, greenfield projects. A lot of companies invested in newer capacities. We haven't seen that still over the last year or so, and that's something that could be a game changer as far as markets are concerned, as far as the economy is concerned over the next year or so. We haven't seen credit growth to the extent that we should have generally seen. Credit growth. Banks are flush with funds, but we haven't seen the kind of credit growth that one would have expected to see. So as a result, what's really happening is banks which are flush with liquidity have been lending to even lower rated or weaker companies or SMEs at a significantly lower rate, which would mean that they're actually lending to higher risk assets at a reasonably low interest rate. That's the risk that some of these loans are likely to have going forward, going ahead, and which is something that one must keep in mind. So when one looks at the positives as far as banking is concerned, a lot of them have got recapitalized. All the NPAs have probably been provided. You're likely to see a fairly clean balance sheet. You're seeing some of the weaker banks which had done questionable loans going out of circulation. All of us know what happened to whatever, a Yes Bank or a DHFL, or what is rumored to be happening as far as another private sector bank that showed up sometime last week. So what's clearly happening is the weak are getting weaker, the larger banks, as in all businesses, the larger banks are getting larger, and you could see even further consolidation happening within the banking space, where you could see the weaker ones getting bought out by a lot of the larger banks or the stronger banks that are concerned. The advent of fintechs is again that's something that's creating taking up a reasonable amount of wallet share from the financial from the banks or from the NBFC. So that's going to be another big growth segment within the financial space that could be there. And when one talks of BFSI as a holistic picture, as a larger picture, obviously you have insurance companies which are getting the benefit of an underinsured population or underinsured country, their premiums are rising and rising fast. So insurance companies are showing up well in terms of overall growth. Asset management companies and broking companies typically at times when markets are up will always show up significantly higher profitability and top line and bottom line growth. So you're seeing a lot of the positives in the entire BFSI space. So a lot of these sectors really showing up in positive light. Like I said, turned around from loss to profit. The weaker sectors, the stronger sectors have got stronger. The larger businesses have grown even larger, but the weaker businesses have, the smaller businesses, I would say, the unorganized sector has got weaker. So there's clearly movement that's happened from the unorganized to the organized, from the informal to the formal sector. GST is one big contributor for that, which is ensuring that not just are a lot of the unaccounted transactions that were there earlier, them getting reflected as far as government collections are concerned, but also clearly showing up in terms of formalization of the entire economy. So a lot of the sectors, again, one can cover even IT for that matter. IT is being one of the biggest beneficiaries, like I said earlier, of digitization. Indian IT companies, which a few years back one used to just talk about the potential order flow coming out for or from digitization or from AI or from big data. A lot of that is actually now getting converted into huge orders from very large clients in the West. And if one looks at the overall market share that Indian companies have had in the global space in terms of IT, a lot of these IT companies have actually gained significantly. One for tennis fans, you would when you see a lot of the ATP matches, when you see, let's say, all the Grand Slams, you'll always see Infosys being advertised there because they've clearly created a lot of the software or the digitization of the entire sport. In the same way, a lot of the other sports spending a lot, virtually all across. We actually covered a lot of businesses getting digitized, but virtually all around. You look at sport, that's getting digitized. You look at a lot of the manufacturing sector, that's got digitized, increasingly digitized. So as a result, not just in the global scenario in terms of order flow, but also in the domestic markets, one has seen a fair amount of order flow coming in for some of these small-sized and mid-sized IT companies. So that's something that you're showing, you're seeing in terms of top-line growth, profitability. So a lot of the mid-sized companies have become large-sized in the IT space. A lot of the small-sized have become mid-sized through sheer growth in the last 2 years. And that's one space which, again, we're fairly positive about, and where one is likely to see fairly continued growth. Valuations is one leg of it, but when one looks at it from a growth point of view, something that had fallen to virtually double-digit growth, or in certain cases even less than double-digit growth, has over the last 2 years or so virtually doubled and become closer to either of 15% and in certain cases even 18 to 20% growth that is there. The profitability or margins have in certain cases gone up. So you're really seeing a huge amount of re-rating that's happened for a lot of the sectors, IT being one of them, but several other sectors have got re-rated as well. So overall, one continues to be positive, cautiously positive, because you might not see the same kind of growth or increase in stock prices of virtually every single stock that you saw in the last say 2 or 3 quarters till the markets peaked in October 2021. You saw even now there are several stocks in the mid cap and the small cap space that you see keep hitting upper circuits, but if one sees the fundamentals, again, it becomes questionable. So one probably needs to be a lot more selective in 2022. You could be a bottom-up stock picker and make very good gains. The indices might consolidate and be range bound, but if one looks at it from a stock picking, bottom-up stock picking point of view, you could see stocks which could give you significant gains even during this year. But from an indices point of view, one should be more conservative. You could probably see 12 to 14% gains that could come about as far as large cap indices are concerned. There could be a fair amount of volatility of the kind one has seen in the last 10 days or so. Markets in Nifty falling 1,000 points, gaining back 1,000 points, virtually 100 to 200 point daily Nifty movement. So that's a fair amount of volatility when one looks at markets on a intraday basis. But during 2022, you could again see sort of time correction or sideways movement or consolidation of the markets that could happen. So, like I said, positive as far as markets are concerned. Individual stock-based bottom-up stock picking should benefit the investors, and hopefully that will make 2022 as good a year as we've seen as far as 2021 is concerned for all of you investors. And I'm sure all of you will actually be smiling when we are talking about filing tax returns or seeing your portfolios grow, or when one looks at the short-term and long-term gains that you're going to make. So I'll stop with that thought, and we can have questions from the participants coming in.
Thank you very much, Nipun Mehta sir. Now for such a nice deliberation. Hope our members will be benefited from this. And now I request our viewers, if they have any queries, they can write down in chat box or question answer. Sir, there is one query from Mr. Aniruddha Jaju. Sir, what's your views on IPO valuation in current scenario and SEBI's role in it? जैसा कि अभी पेटीएम में हमने देखा है या दूसरी जो भी आईपीओ हैं, वो कहीं ना कहीं एक रेस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी जरूर होनी चाहिए कि उसका प्राइस इतना स्मॉल जो शेयर होल्डर हैं उनके इंटरेस्ट को कहीं ना कहीं प्रोटेक्ट किया जाना चाहिए. व्हाट्स योर व्यूज?
So let me start by saying that equity is a risk asset. So when you are applying for IPOs, you cannot purely go by the frenzy of it. Risk factors में और मीडिया में बहुत ज्यादा हाईलाइट हुआ था for some of these IPOs that they are unlikely to see profits for the next, don't ask how many years. पूछिए मत कि कितने साल तक losses होंगे, लेकिन valuation हमको इतना चाहिए. So obviously one needs to be a lot more rational or judicious as far as some of these valuations are concerned. Having said that, I think अभी इस तरह के IPOs काफी आएंगे. It's just a start as far as startup valuations and startup IPOs are concerned. There is a fair amount of control that both SEBI and to some extent even RBI is doing. So if some of you might be aware that of course all of us are aware that a lot of this oversubscription happens because of IPO funding that is there. So on the one side you have the anchor book that is there, institutions that book is heavily oversubscribed. SEBI has made some changes in that also in terms of the lock-in, in terms of the kind of money they need to pay upfront. So that's something that in terms of the size of applications could be a little more controlled. Or oversubscription, जो retail public होती है, they'll typically see the extent of oversubscription that is there and just jump in. The HNI investors typically go about based on the grey market premium that is there, and they will borrow big time. And there are investors who make one time the IPO as their own application, as a single application. So when you see 300 times oversubscription, it comes significantly out of this IPO funding that happens. So RBI has already announced some time back, in fact, that from 1st April 2022, banks will not be able to lend, or NBFCs, not banks, but banks have anyway a cap of 20 lakhs, but NBFCs will not be able to lend more than 1 crore per individual for these IPOs. So that's something that's likely to bring down the extent of oversubscription that is there. So frenzy chali hai, that control is likely to be there. So RBI's contribution is in that. SEBI's contribution will probably be more in terms of ensuring that these premiums are a little more within control. But investor himself also has to be clearly watching the kind of valuation that are there. And there will be several such instances. 2022 में इस तरह के IPOs आएंगे, and one will need to be cautious. There is froth in them, but some of them over a period of time, like I said, there are already 2 or 3 of them which are showing up as potential index candidates over the next 4 to 5 years.
One more question is from Jignesh Shah, which is also relating to this only. To what extent one can rely on very high valuation of unicorn IPOs, for example, Nykaa versus Infosys?
So the other trend that we've seen, Devendraji, in this is, of course, something like a Nykaa and Infosys are not comparable. So they're in different businesses. But the other trend that we've seen as far as some of these IPOs are concerned is if there is an IPO in a business which, so for a moment, let's keep the startups on one side. Let's look at other companies. Let's say there were pharma companies that came about. There were other IT companies that came about with their IPOs, which suddenly had a PE multiple which was significantly higher than some of the existing companies. So if you had an IT company which had a mid-cap IT company which had a PE of, let's say, 25 or 30, and suddenly you had another IT company which came out with an IPO, they suddenly had a PE of 50 or 60. So there was a huge gap. There's a huge gap for some of these newer IPOs. What it clearly means probably is that investors were looking for newer ideas. They were tired of all the old IPOs or the old listed companies that were there. And they lapped up some of these new businesses, newer ideas, newer business models that came about. And that's why you saw a fair amount of sort of frenzy for these IPOs. But when one looks at pure startups, one goes back to the same thinking of acquisition of, let's say, Hotmail by Microsoft in 1997 or thereabouts, when Samir Bhatia was paid $400 million. And actually, eyes popped out. $400 million was a huge amount of money in those days. And eyes popped out saying, the service is for free. In those days, there weren't as many users as they probably have now in terms of the email IDs that or the extent of usage of email that is there. But you still had a $4 million kind of valuation that came about. You've seen something similar when Facebook acquired WhatsApp, where it was again obscene valuations. You saw that the company actually benefiting out of higher users. So some of these newer ones, and you'll have, like I said, several more in the fintech and edtech business that will come about, which will have these kind of valuations. What one needs to be very cautious about is that one does not touch the variety of, like I said earlier, you have a revenue of 1 crore and you have a valuation of 20,000 crores. It probably, you have a revenue of 1 crore, you have a loss of 700 to 800 crores, and you have a valuation of 20,000 crores. That's not something that's sustainable. So one needs to be cautious about those kind of IPOs. But some of the some of the startups which have gone public at least have a business model, at least have a potential for growth, at least have, some of them have visibility of profits, some of them are making profits. It might not be huge, but when one looks at something like a Nykaa, profitability is not great, but at least there is that visibility of growth that is there in terms of the product profile that they've got. So some of these companies will be positive. You've seen something similar happening as far as Nazara is concerned. Let me just clarify, all of these are just examples. None of these mention of any companies is at all a recommendation for any of these companies to be bought or closely looked at. But these are again something like a Nazara, which probably wasn't or which started off about 2.5 decades back as a garage company, started out of a garage and has really shown up very well in terms of the gaming business is concerned. So you have newer businesses like gaming, like an online FMCG business, which really is showing up in terms of investors liking the novelty of that business. You're muted, Devendra ji.
Yes, sir. Sorry. One more question from Mr. Anup T. Jacob. Up to 2014-15, the PE ratio was bouncing between 15 to 18 times. Now it is at 30 times. Isn't that re-rating of our equity? Is it a vote of confidence for our managers or a bubble in the making?
So a lot of these re-rating for a lot of the sectors happens purely given the kind of prospects some of these industries have. So one is, if one goes back, like I said, for the IT industry in 2013-14 or thereabouts, their growth had actually fallen to double digit or less than double digit growth. What one has seen in terms of contribution of revenues or number of kind of orders that one has seen from the global markets, from the domestic markets, for a lot of these IT companies has ensured that on a larger base, believe me, that's the key word here. On a larger base, they're still growing at closer to 15 or 18%. And that's a huge case for re-rating for the entire sector or for a lot of the companies within that sector which have shown that kind of growth. The same goes for a lot of other sectors where 4 or 5 years back there seemed to be limited visibility in terms of potential for future growth, and all of a sudden, like I said, infrastructure companies which had gone through a lull between say 2015, 16, or 17, despite a lot of government spending on infrastructure, was because of a reason. The sector itself was going through problems. It had payment issues because the government was delaying payments. It had execution issues because land could not be acquired. State governments were not helping. Central governments were not helping. Projects were left half completed. Payments weren't made for some of those half complete projects, or even if projects were completed, full payments didn't come about. So they went through a lot of challenging times over the last or between that period of 2013-14 or 14-15 on to 17-18. Now, when you look at the turnaround that is there as far as a lot of these companies are concerned, repayment of debt, orders getting executed, land acquisition becoming that much more simple, ensuring that there are bonuses, in fact, that some of these companies have got for timely execution of projects. All of that is something that has turned around the infrastructure sector, and you're likely to see a re-rating happening. You're seeing that for the entire capex sector, where the visibility of orders coming in for capacity increase or any greenfield projects wasn't happening a few years back. In fact, we've seen almost a decade of very limited capex happening within the country, private sector capex particularly, and that's something that's now changing, that's turning around, and you're seeing more orders coming in. So probably again, sector like capex, which could go, which could change further in terms of getting re-rated. So it's sector dependent, but very clearly the visibility of earnings, the visibility of order flow is something that's ensuring that the re-rating will continue for a lot of these sectors, even going into 2022.
Sir, one more question from this Rajiv Kumar Jha, sir. What is your view on budget and impact of Omicron?
Well, I think that's one risk factor. Omicron is one big risk factor that's always going to be around. One has seen highest number of cases 2 days back as far as US is concerned. The potential third wave is something that's coming about as a huge risk. I think a lot of businesses have learned how to deal with these kind of situations now. People not coming in, lower staff, lower attendance, working from home. I think a lot of companies, a lot of managements have understood how they could handle that a little better. What could act as a potential higher risk could be a complete lockdown that some of these states or states could announce. You've already seen that happening in a few countries. In fact, some of the countries in Europe have already announced a lockdown. Some of the states in India have announced a partial lockdown, closure of schools, 10 p.m. to 5 p.m. lockdown, complete lockdown, restaurants 50%, theaters 50%. So we are actually going back to the second wave kind of situation where there could be very limited movement that could happen, that could come about. Our sense is the impact might not be as bad as it was during the second lockdown in terms of complete stoppage of work. But if there is a complete lockdown announced of the variety that we had seen in 2020 or during the second wave in 2021, earnings could partially get impacted. So that's a risk factor which one needs to keep in mind. I think the budget increasingly has had a limited impact as far as corporate earnings are concerned. Really, the government now does realize that it's wrong to keep tinkering with tax rates. So maybe what we've seen over the last 5 years, both for individual and corporate taxes, is only lowering of taxes. We haven't really seen too much tinkering. It's something which has only benefited and ensured that benefited individual or corporate taxpayers, and only ensured that there are more and more people filing tax returns. So we saw that even as far as the reversal of certain tax laws that was there for foreigners. That's something that's clearly showing up that the government is unlikely to keep doing that. So there's clearly more stability as far as taxation is concerned. There's more certainty or visibility of infrastructure spending is concerned as far as the government is what the government is doing. There's greater monetary power, fiscal power that the government clearly has out of higher taxes or higher direct and indirect taxes. So in terms of the uncertainty that or the kind of microscopic analysis that we used to have on fiscal deficit is something which at least fortunately was overlooked, was not taken into consideration during the COVID time. But going ahead, that's something which the higher tax collection is something that would clearly ensure that the government is able to spend that much more on infrastructure. So we don't see budget being a major factor in how markets could change in any big way. But overall, I think corporates do understand that now there is a stability of regime that is there on taxation, both direct and indirect, and that's not something that's likely to disrupt businesses while they are going about their business.
आपने बहुत ही डिटेल में एक्सप्लेन किया सर. इसमें कल ही मैं एक बसंत माहेश्वरी जी का इंटरव्यू सुन रहा था टाइम्स नाउ पे. तो उनका ओपिनियन था कि बजट में बहुत ज्यादा नेगेटिव तो मार्केट के लिए नहीं आने की संभावना है, बिकॉज उसका लॉजिक ये है कि गवर्नमेंट को LIC का IPO भी लेके आना है, और गवर्नमेंट अभी ऐसा कोई कदम नहीं लेगी या जैसे टैक्स की रेट में, लॉन्ग टर्म कैपिटल गेन टैक्स की रेट में ऐसी कोई छेड़खानी नहीं करेगी जिससे कि मार्केट उसको एक्सेप्ट ना करे. तो मेरे ख्याल से राजीव जी, हमें उम्मीद रखनी चाहिए गवर्नमेंट एक अच्छा बजट देगी, और 5 राज्यों में चुनाव भी आने वाले हैं, तो गवर्नमेंट का हमेशा इलेक्शन पे भी एक ध्यान रहता ही है, तो उसका भी एक इफेक्ट होना चाहिए. नाउ वन मोर क्वेश्चन फ्रॉम अनूप टी जैकब सर. Isn't there a point on the fact that bank interest rate, deposit rates is at an all-time low? Therefore, retail investors are also rushing to the market either directly or through mutual funds, which is causing this rising stock indices.
So that's a clear, one of the clear obvious reasons why you are seeing sort of on the one side financialization of the economy. On the other side, funds moving in from fixed income, a lot of the post office deposits, a lot of the bank deposits, which are now gradually moving on to mutual funds and directly onto the equity markets. And a lot of these investors are actually making earning returns, but much higher than what they would have earned in some of these fixed income instruments. So what's happening is, and all of us know that when one looks at the global statistics on the number of equity investors that each of these countries have, you look at US, which is close to 55% of the population, which is invested in the equity markets. You have most European countries which are in the mid-teens or in the, close to 20% of the population being invested in the equity markets. It's only in India that you've seen just about 6 to 7% of the population being in equity markets, and that's something that could that has changed over the last 2 years, when you've seen virtually quadrupling of the number of equity investors that have been that have participated in the markets. But that is what has happened because of that is that has also deepened the financial markets, in the sense that you have a much larger AUM as far as mutual funds are concerned. So whenever there is a huge amount of FII selling, there is a corresponding balancing factor that both insurance companies and mutual funds are in a position to sort of create a balance whenever there's a huge amount of selling. So you don't see the kind of volatility which otherwise we could have seen given the kind of FI selling that typically otherwise comes about. So it has deepened the markets. It's ensuring that you have more people understanding financial, not just understanding financial markets, but also ensuring that, let's say, a segment like or sector like insurance, and like I said, in an underinsured economy, underinsured population, you're seeing a lot more insurance being taken. That's ensuring that the life insurance companies grow significantly in size, and again, with the funds at their disposal, are able to invest into the economy, invest into the bond markets, invest into the equity markets. So it's deepening the markets, and that's a serious positive that I see as far as the economy is concerned.
Definitely, sir. One more reason we can also see the जो हमारे जो viewers थे अनूप जी, इन्हीं का एक पुराना क्वेश्चन था जिसमें उन्होंने कहा P ratio is bouncing back 15, 18 to 30 times. This is the one of the reason that earlier FD interest rate was say 8%, 10%. Now it is 4 to 5%, 6%. So accordingly, re-rating has been done. मार्केट का जो पी था वो 10 या 15 के रेट में था, तो वो आपको 15% रिटर्न अगर हम दे रहे हैं, 15 टाइम हम उस अर्निंग का देने को तैयार हैं. तो अब अगर हम मेरा फिक्स डिपॉजिट जो रिस्क फ्री रिटर्न जो है वो अगर मेरा 6% 8% से रिड्यूस होके 5% हो गया, यानी अराउंड 60% रिडक्शन हो गया, तो प्रोपोर्शनेटली पी रेशियो विल आल्सो एडजस्ट अकॉर्डिंग टू दैट इंटरेस्ट रेट. एक और क्वेश्चन हमारे साथ आया है घनश्याम जी जोशी का. हमारे एक दो व्यूअर्स ने मैसेज किया है, सर इफ यू कैन एक्सप्लेन इन हिंदी इट वुड बी बेटर बिकॉज़ मोस्ट ऑफ द मेंबर्स आर फ्रॉम सेंट्रल इंडिया. घनश्याम जी जोशी, उनका क्वेश्चन है हाउ टू आइडेंटिफाई टर्न अराउंड स्टॉक्स फ्रॉम एनी सेक्टर. वेरी गुड क्वेश्चन फ्रॉम घनश्याम जी, क्योंकि सारी थ्योरी आज की डेट में वही है, हाउ यू आइडेंटिफाई द स्टॉक एट अ लोअर लेवल एंड आफ्टर 2-3 years you say it is a turnaround theory, and then stock multiplied 10-20 times.
So I think when you look for turnaround stocks, the first thing to look for is, has the sector turned around? Was the stock suffering because its sector wasn't doing well, or was it not doing well because of management issues or because it had funding issues? So one obviously needs to look deeper into when one is doing bottom-up stock picking or bottom-up research. One needs to look at a lot of these kind of aspects. Let's take a case where sector itself wasn't doing too well. So as an example, let's say the sugar sector it's a very small sector, but काफी उसमें retail investor का participation रहता है, इसीलिए just as an example I'm putting it. कि एज अ सेक्टर इटसेल्फ ये ठीक नहीं कर रहा था। गवर्नमेंट इंटरवेंशन की वजह से प्राइसिंग, जो भी इंटरवेंशन होता था, स्टेट गवर्नमेंट्स का इंटरवेंशन होता था, एक्सपोर्ट्स पे उसका इंटरवेंशन होता था। सो क्लियरली एंटायर स्पेस में तकलीफ होती, में प्रॉफिटेबिलिटी का इशू आता था। ह्यूज डेट सब कंपनीज के, शुगर कंपनीज पे था, के बुक्स पे था, और कई सालों तक ये डेट रिपेमेंट नहीं हुआ, कंपनी के लॉसेस हो रहे थे, कंपनीज के पूरे लॉसेस, वर्चुअली ऑल कंपनीज। जब एक टर्न अराउंड हुआ, जब एक थोड़ा गवर्नमेंट ने रिलैक्सेशन अनाउंस किया मोलासेस के लिए, और फ्यूल में उसका यूज करने के लिए, शुगर का बाय प्रोडक्ट यूज करने के लिए, सो क्लियरली एक शुगर कंपनीज को एक ऑप्शन मिल गया इन टर्म्स ऑफ रेवेन्यू, इन टर्म्स ऑफ प्रॉफिटेबिलिटी, एंड दे वर नॉट जस्ट डिपेंडेंट ऑन अ सिंगल प्रोडक्ट। तो जो एक इंडस्ट्री टर्न अराउंड होती है, तो उसमें स्टॉक आइडेंटिफाई करना, टर्न अराउंड आइडेंटिफाई करना to an extent आसान हो सकता है, because you're looking at the stronger companies within that, for a potential turnaround based on the balance sheet. But otherwise, on a standalone basis, एक कोई company identify करनी हो, I think it can come about only by keeping eyes and ears open. Is there a government reform that can make a big difference as far as a particular company is concerned? उसमें turnaround हो सकता है क्या? As an example, EVs became a hot sort of sector a year and a half back. So suddenly, companies जो जिनके स्टॉक प्राइस 10, 20, 25 रुपए हुआ करते थे, सडनली जो आइदर इलेक्ट्रिक व्हीकल्स बनाती हैं, या उसमें एक OEM है जिसमें बहुत बेनिफिट हो सकता है, तो all of these companies started turning around considerably. So what was it due to? It was clearly because of some government announcement that EVs को अभी बहुत encourage करेंगे, या globally a lot of these companies started manufacturing more of EVs. तो कोई एक गवर्नमेंट अनाउंसमेंट होती है जिसके बेसिस पे एक कंपनी टर्न अराउंड हो जाती है. सो वन कुड बी सेक्टर वाइज टर्न अराउंड दैट कुड बी देयर, एंड विद इन दैट यू आइडेंटिफाई कंपनीज. अदर्स कुड बी बिकॉज ऑफ स्पेसिफिक अनाउंसमेंट्स where a new sector or a new story typically comes about. The other opportunity was PLI. PLI की वजह से कई companies को suddenly government orders या expansion की opportunity मिल गई. So a lot of these, if we are on the lookout for these kind of opportunities, turnaround stocks, if one looks for these opportunities, turnaround stocks can be relatively easy to identify. And in these kind of markets, I'm sure fellow CAs can do a wonderful job while identifying some of these turnaround companies.
बिल्कुल ठीक कहा सर आपने कि being a chartered accountant, it's very easy for us to, because we understand the balance sheet, we understand the economy, we understand the budget, we understand the government policy. तो बहुत आसान है हमारे लिए. थोड़ी सी अगर हम मेहनत करेंगे तो हम आइडेंटिफाई कर पाएंगे, और हमारे सराउंडिंग फैक्ट्स को आपको चेक करना चाहिए कि क्या चीज नई हो रही है और क्या चीज नई नहीं हो रही है. अगर आप उससे देखेंगे तो आप काफी चीजें आइडेंटिफाई कर पाएंगे. और अगर आप अपने जो सराउंडिंग में जो चीजें हो रही है उनको अगर आप देखें कि इनके बैलेंस शीट पे क्या इम्पैक्ट आने वाले हैं और फ्यूचर को थोड़ा सा फोरकास्ट करें, तो मेरे ख्याल से ये एक बहुत बड़ा सेक्टर है और बहुत बड़ी एक इसमें प्रोफेशनल अपॉर्चुनिटी भी है हमारे जो चार्टर्ड अकाउंटेंट आज जो व्यूअर्स हैं उनके लिए, कि हम हमारे लिए भी इन्वेस्ट कर सकते हैं. हम लोग जो दो तरीके के लोग आज इस प्रोग्राम को देख रहे होंगे, एक तो अपना खुद का इन्वेस्टमेंट करने के लिए, और हम लोग हमारे क्लाइंट का इन्वेस्टमेंट भी इसमें करा सकते हैं. और उसके लिए हमें थोड़े सा स्टडी करने की जरूरत है. तो एक बहुत बड़ी अपॉर्चुनिटी यहाँ पैदा हो सकती है. वन मोर क्वेश्चन इज फ्रॉम घनश्याम. पैरामीटर्स आर मोर इम्पोर्टेंट फॉर रियल्टी और इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर स्टॉक सिलेक्शन.
Sorry, Devenji, could you just repeat that?
Yes, sir. Which parameters are more important for realty oblique infrastructure stock selection?
So one must remember that growth for or any project implementation for ये infrastructure companies हो या real estate companies हो, comes out of huge amount of borrowing. ये time गया जब because of RERA now earlier their funding used to happen by projects getting launched. Now that is no longer the case. रेरा के बाद real estate companies को funding काफी खुद arrange करने की जरूरत पड़ती है. So a lot of that shows up on the balance sheet. Infrastructure companies as well have to, the more the number of projects they bid for and the larger the number of projects that are there, for execution, successful execution of each of these projects, they need to put up honest money, they need to put up the fair amount of working capital. So आप जितना बड़ा project करो उतना ज़्यादा working capital आपको करने की deploy करने की जरूरत पड़ जाती है. So clearly balance sheet quality becomes very important in terms of trying to understand both infrastructure and real estate projects. Companies which are able to raise funds at a relatively low cost. So real estate में देखेंगे तो जो top की 5-7 कंपनियां हैं, उनका जो borrowing cost है, it is probably 500 to 700 basis points lower than the small sized ones. तो आप देखोगे तो जो बड़ी कंपनियां हैं 11-12% में पैसे रेज करती हैं. In some cases probably even lower than that. और जो majority companies हैं, real estate companies हैं, वो almost 16, 17, 18 कुछ समय पहले 20-22% पे, in fact in certain cases even more than that, they used to be raising funds. So cost of funds बहुत critical हो जाता है. किस तरह का cost of funds है real estate companies के लिए. Even for infrastructure, किस तरह का working capital use है, cost of funds किस तरह है, execution कितनी तेजी से होता है, delays करते हैं या नहीं delay करते हैं. So a lot of those aspects become important while assessing कि real estate companies में क्या अच्छा है या infrastructure companies में कौन सी अच्छी है.
Sir, definitely whatever you said is absolutely very much logical and interesting for each one of the investors. But at the same time, we need to understand as far as the infrastructure sector is concerned, as government is planning to pump up the funds, especially the infrastructure projects which were not in a good condition earlier, which were in a very bad condition earlier. Government involved NBCC and other government agencies which are involved into completion of the projects and all. So in that case, what do you think that it is going to give a positive impact to the infrastructure market or real estate market?
So, Abdulji, like I said, infrastructure mein the uncertainty that had been there when you go back about 5 years was that there was something called a public-private partnership PPP model that was there.
Yeah.
जिसमें there was जो project execution. Why is it that infrastructure ran into a problem 5 years back? जो project execution होता था उसमें either of land, जो अगर land acquisition नहीं हुआ तो उससे there was the delay that happened because of the project. The entity that suffered was the infrastructure company. There was no impact on it as far as the government is concerned. तो पैसे लग गए, वर्किंग कैपिटल लग गया, इनिशियली कुछ लैंड एक्विजिशन हो गया, उसके पैसे लग गए, उसके पैसे शायद गवर्नमेंट ने आपको पेमेंट भी कर दिया टू व्हाटएवर एक्सटेंट दैट वाज व्हाटएवर परसेंटेजेस इज पेड टू देम. लेकिन क्लियरली जो प्रोजेक्ट कंप्लीट नहीं होता है तो जो ईएम देना पड़ता है प्रोजेक्ट इम्प्लीमेंटेशन के लिए, एग्जीक्यूशन के लिए, उसमें जो अगर डिले होता है तो आपका वर्किंग कैपिटल लॉकअप हो जाता है, आपकी इंटरेस्ट कॉस्ट बढ़ जाती है, आपके इनकम्प्लीट प्रोजेक्ट की वजह से आपको नए प्रोजेक्ट्स नहीं मिलते हैं, आपके एबिलिटी टू बिड फॉर न्यूअर प्रोजेक्ट्स ये कॉम्प्रोमाइज हो जाता है बिकॉज योर वर्किंग कैपिटल इज लॉक्ड अप. सो a weak balance sheet or a highly leveraged balance sheet is something which is totally detrimental as far as infrastructure is concerned. So change, बदलाव ये आया पिछले 2 या 3 सालों में, is that government realized that payments were not going into infrastructure companies. In fact, when they came out with tenders, suddenly companies which were regular bidders never bid. इनको एक्चुअली टेंडरिंग में तकलीफ हो रही थी, कंपनीज बिड ही नहीं कर रही थी प्रोजेक्ट्स के लिए, या फिर बहुत वीक कंपनीज बिड कर रही थी जिनको पहले इस तरह का एक्सपीरियंस ना हो, व्हिच इज व्हेन दे रियलाइज दैट प्रोबेबली इनके बैलेंस शीट्स स्ट्रेस्ड हैं, इनको पास पेमेंट करने की जरूरत है, इनको इनकम्प्लीट प्रोजेक्ट्स कंप्लीट करने की जरूरत है ताकि इनका वर्किंग कैपिटल फ्लो शुरू हो जाए, प्रोजेक्ट्स कंप्लीट हो जाए, इनके पैसे वापस मिल जाए. सो दैट वाज समथिंग व्हिच changed as far as the infrastructure companies is concerned. Also, if you go back 3 or 4 years, that PPP model was changed into different kinds of models for infrastructure companies. Like HAM project आपने जैसे सुना होगा, hybrid annuity model, जिसकी वजह से the extent of funding that was required was a lot less as compared to the PPP model for the infrastructure companies. So काफी reforms आए, बदलाव आया, जिसकी वजह से at least some of these companies could finish their projects. पैसे अटक गए थे, वो वापस आ गए, government payments हो गए. उसकी वजह से at least one can see now that infrastructure gradually, at least जो companies में balance sheet stronger हो गए हैं, they are coming back in terms of bidding, and they are you're actually seeing that in terms of the newer projects that a lot of them have been getting from whoever, NHAI, private sector, जो भी हो.
Yes, sir. I believe one reason may be like the earlier in infrastructure, majorly the industrialists or the promoters were launching the projects even without having the land. But now these kind of promoters are not working, not functioning. Major of the promoters are who are already having a land, and then they are willing to start the project. So that may be an as you rightly pointed out, that is the another reason where this infrastructure market is flourishing. Sunaji, I believe any other questions left out?
Yeah, Mr. Abhishek Jain, the question is, when all fundamental and financial are very good of a stock and other factors are also in favor of the stock, then why stock go deep corrected and sideways for long time? You can say example of ITC or IDBI, BPCL, so many examples are there. जिनका फंडामेंटली बैलेंस शीट वगैरह अगर एज ए चार्टर्ड अकाउंटेंट देखेंगे तो बहुत अच्छी होगी, बट वो स्टॉक जो है कि चलता ही नहीं.
So I go by one important statement that Peter Lynch once made, saying that, end of the day, the ticker is God. जो भाव जो बोलता है, भाव भगवान है. One, it's wrong to keep on arguing against it and keep saying, अरे यार ये underpriced stock hai. One has to accept it. That's one. Two, I think a market, a stock market, or broader as a market, there's always a correct assessment that a market makes of a particular company. If you look at, let's say, you mentioned some names, IDBI, IFCI,
ITC.
So I'll come to ITC is a different kind of case, but these two, where balance sheets were not in the healthiest of state. So clearly, when from all the development financial institutions, some of these entities actually changed into banks or tried to change into banks. The types like ICICI were extremely successful, and they converted into banks and they changed their business model. While isme questionable assets, questionable lending definitely tha. So I think that's the reason you're seeing in these two. But in ITC, there's something like an ITC. I think when you see that the sum of parts is very different, when you look at it from individual businesses point of view, uska jo IT business hai, FMCG business hai, I mean, there's enough and more talk and analysis done that if you actually demerge some of these businesses, the kind of sum of parts rating that you might get for an ITC might be very different than what it is, what you might get otherwise. And that's the reason why if you also see the contribution of something like a cigarette business, which was as high as 90-95% several years back, and till some time back was also till at 85%. It's gradually falling. You're seeing contribution by other businesses. They're becoming more and more sizable. But I mean, it's difficult to pinpoint one particular reason for something like for a stock like ITC, whether it is those ESG funds, funds which have become a lot more conscious about ESG and they don't want to buy a cigarette company, or whether it is the very limited expansion that some of these businesses have had. So if you really see many of these businesses, they haven't grown to the extent that similar or that their competitors have grown. So could be various reasons, but I think managements, when they are answerable to their shareholders, are fairly conscious about it, and that's why you're seeing the ITC management also being addressing that very consciously. And probably sooner or later something will come out of it in terms of either a demerger or growth of businesses or higher capex that's announced, and maybe segregating just the cigarette business and ensuring that the other businesses have lot more traction in terms of possibility of growth.
सर कहा जाता है कि स्टॉक मार्केट में कुछ पर्टिकुलर डेज को अगर आप इन्वेस्टेड नहीं हैं तो आप मैक्सिमम जो अपना प्रॉफिट है वो लूज कर चुके होते हैं पर्टिकुलर डेज में, अगर आप नहीं है तो, क्योंकि वो तेजी जो आई है वो उन पर्टिकुलर डेज में नहीं है। तो और यू कैन नॉट आइडेंटिफाई दोज डेज। तो आप जो है पूरा 10 इयर्स लॉन्ग टर्म होराइजन के साथ इन्वेस्टेड रहे तभी आप उसमें रिटर्न कमा पाएंगे। एक व्यू ये आता है। तो हम उसी को एक्सटेंड करें कि हम उसको मार्केट की टाइमिंग करने का कोशिश ना करें और हम उसको इन्वेस्ट करें। अगर हमें कोई कंपनी आइडेंटिफाई होती है तो जैसे सपोज करो आईटीसी के ही संदर्भ में हम बात करें, आज की डेट में एक गुड डिविडेंड पेइंग कंपनी है, 5% 6% डिविडेंड यील्ड है, तो क्या हम उसमें लगा दें और वो डिपॉजिट का रिटर्न तो हमें दे ही रही है, और वन फाइन डे जब डीमर्जर होगा या और अदर उसके डेवलपमेंट्स होंगे तब वो ऑटोमेटिकली स्टॉक प्राइस में भी इंक्रीज होगा, तो हमें रिटर्न जो आज रिटर्न तो मिल ही रहा है, और जब हमें प्राइस एप्रिसिएशन होगा वो बाद में जब होना है तब हो जाएगा। वो डिपेंड करेगा अदर फैक्टर्स, मैनेजमेंट कब डिसीजन लेता है डीमर्जर का या अदर डिसीजन। और दूसरा थॉट ये कहता है कि हम चूंकि अभी नहीं चल रहा है, पिछले 5 साल से हर साल जो है, जब हम आउटलुक 2021 की बात कर रहे थे तब भी कई चैनल ने दिया था कि आईटीसी विल बी द स्टॉक ऑफ द ईयर। 2020 में भी कई सारी कंपनियों में कई सारे एनालिस्ट ने दिया होगा कि आईटीसी जो है अभी 3 साल से नहीं चला, 4 साल से नहीं चला, तो इस साल चलेगा। तो हर साल हम इंतजार में ही दिन निकल जा रहे हैं। तो जब चलना शुरू होगा, 240 होगा, 250 होगा, जब ट्रेंड लाइन क्रॉस करेगी तभी हम अपना फंड उसमें ब्लॉक करें। क्यों हम पहले से ब्लॉक करें? क्योंकि पूरे इंडेक्स ने 40-50% रिटर्न दिया, और अगर मैं 2020 से आईटीसी को लेके बैठा हूं तो मुझे सिर्फ 5% रिटर्न मिला है। तो ये दो थॉट है, उन दोनों थॉट में हमें क्या पॉलिसी फॉलो करना चाहिए?
So there are 5,000 listed companies. Why just focus on only one company in terms of investing under the feeling that it is underpriced? So that's one big question that is there. The second observation that would be there to it is even a stock like Reliance between 2010 and 2019, वो कुछ मूवमेंट 10 साल तक, और ऐसे कई स्टॉक हैं, रिलायंस तो एक एग्जांपल है बिकॉज सबके नजर में होता है, बट ऐसे कई स्टॉक्स हैं जो साइडवेज मूवमेंट सालों साल तक करते हैं और सडनली फिर एक उसमें मूवमेंट हो जाती है और दे बिकम मल्टीपल्स। सो 4,999 कंपनी दूसरी है, उसमें भी देखें तो अपॉर्चुनिटी साइज बहुत ज्यादा है, बट आईटी पे जो अगर फोकस करना हो तो डिविडेंड यील्ड स्टॉक्स तो काफी और हैं। देयर आर सेवरल, इफ यू गो बाय प्योर डिविडेंड यील्ड, देयर आर सेवरल PSUs which have got a dividend yield as good as ITC or better than ITC, and which also have the businesses which actually have grown, and where there is now in view of the government decision to privatize a lot of the businesses, there's a possibility that some of these businesses will get privatized as well. So उसमें भी opportunity size काफी हो सकती है. So one needs to look at it from each the comfort level on each stock basis. The same PSU stock could behave far better than an ITC in terms of a dividend yield, and then sudden price rise that could just happen because it might get sold, and the private sector player might pay a significantly higher price, and the other stock where you're not invested could just lie low or stay low for quite some time. So
वेरी ट्रू सर, PSU सेक्टर्स का डिविडेंड रेट जो है वो इट इज मच हायर देन ITC, बट लास्ट 3-4 इयर्स का जो हमारा एक्सपीरियंस रहा, इफ आई इन्वेस्टेड रुपीज से 1 lakh इन सम पर्टिकुलर PSU सेक्टर, एंड इफ इट इज गोइंग डिलीवरिंग मी 10% डिविडेंड यील्ड, बट वो 10% डिविडेंड तो मिल गया सर, उसका प्राइस मेरा जो है वो आधा रह गया। So again, I am losing on that side, but the safety in ITC in pricing के अंदर जो है मोटा मोटी जो है 180 और 220, 240, तो एक रेंज बाउंड जो स्टॉक है वो एक मिलने की उम्मीद है, इसलिए हमने आईटीसी को प्रेफरेंस दिया पीएसयू में। पीएसयू में हमारा मानना है कि पिछले कई सालों से जब हम कई सारे पीएसयू के साथ एसोसिएटेड हैं, वहां का एक पियोन का सैलरी 2 लाख रुपए 1 लाख रुपया होता है। तो और वो करता क्या है, चाय पिलाएगा और एक फाइल देगा। तो वो कर तो शेयर होल्डर की कॉस्ट पे ही रहा है ना एम्प्लॉयमेंट। तो अगर आपको नौकरी करनी है तो पीएसयू की बेस्ट है, बिना काम करे आपको सैलरी मिल रही है। बट अगर हम एज ए शेयर होल्डर देखें तो वो जेब में से पैसा तो शेयर होल्डर का ही निकल के जा रहा है। उस स्पिरिट में हमने वो प्राइवेट सेक्टर को थोड़ा प्रेफरेंस दिया। तो अ, हमारे पास और क्वेश्चन, एक और क्वेश्चन आया है सर घनश्याम जी का। Is fundamental study, it is said that the stock P should be lesser than the industrial P. But nowadays, all stock which are doing well or running high in majority of the cases, the stock P is very high as compared to the industrial P. Likewise, other parameters, do we say that in bull run, technical parameters are more important than fundamental?
So when you say the P is high or is higher, market always, as all of us know, discounts the future. So कई कंपनीज में, कई सेक्टर्स में ये लगता है कि अगले 2 साल तक, 3 साल तक, 5 साल तक, अगर आप ईवी कंपनीज का, द बिगेस्ट एग्जांपल इज ईवी कंपनीज, उसके पी रेशियोज देखेंगे तो ऑब्जीन है। स्टार्टअप्स जो हैं, फिनटेक्स, एडटेक्स, मेडटेक्स, ये सब टेक कंपनीज हैं, उनके पीज बहुत ज्यादा हैं। ज्यादा तो क्या, लॉस मेकिंग कंपनीज के भी भाव कुछ अनाप शनाप है। सो द ऑब्वियस रीजन इज the market sees an opportunity size over the next 4 to 5 years कि इसमें बहुत ग्रोथ हो सकता है। Now ये भी हो सकता है कि ये हाई पीज, they don't actually, the opportunity size does not turn out to be as big and those P's come down. And it could also be that, the market hasn't still realized the extent of opportunity size, or पहले एस्टिमेटेड था कि ईवीज फॉर एग्जांपल 2030 तक लॉन्च हो जाएंगी, अब एस्टिमेट हो रहा है कि 2025 तक काफी व्हीकल्स ईवीज हो जाएंगे। तो ऑब्वियसली जो टाइम फ्रेम है वो श्रिंक हो गया है, 10 साल की वजह से 5 साल हो गया है। तो एक पीईज में एक री रेटिंग आगे और भी हो जाता है। सो यू माइट फील दैट अ पी ऑफ whatever, say 50 or 70 or 100 for some of these companies is extremely high, and all of a sudden you might see that 50 becomes 100 purely because there is change in circumstances. So इस तरह से कई सेक्टर्स में हुआ है। सडनली लेट्स से शुगर सेक्टर की बात करें तो इथेनॉल की जो गवर्नमेंट ने अनाउंस किया था पहले कि X% कुड बी यूज्ड इन फ्यूल, सडनली गवर्नमेंट ने चेंजेस अनाउंस कर दिया, ज्यादा और यूज हो सकता है, फिर और अनाउंस कर दिया और ज्यादा यूज हो सकता है। तो अपॉर्चुनिटी साइज लोगों को ज्यादा दिखने लगी, प्रॉफिटेबिलिटी की अपॉर्चुनिटी ज्यादा दिखने लगी। तो शुगर कंपनीज में पहले नेग्लिजिबल रेटिंग हुआ, पी हुआ करता था, 2, 5, 10 का हुआ करता था, सडनली 15-20 हो गया, सडनली अभी और भी बढ़ने लगा। सो सेक्टर वाइज, इंडिविजुअली स्टॉक वाइज, बेस्ड ऑन डेवलपमेंट्स, बेस्ड ऑन अनाउंसमेंट्स, री रेटिंग होने से ये कोई इसमें नई बात नहीं है, कोई ताजुब नहीं है। वन कैन एक्चुअली कम अक्रॉस सेवरल सच इंस्टेंसेस।
बिल्कुल सही कहा सर आपने। जैसे आपने कहा भाव भगवान है, तो उसी कड़ी में जैसे हमने भी अभी और दूसरा स्टॉक के पी में कई बार हमें देखने का नजरिया भी आता है, मार्केट जो है फ्यूचर को प्रेडिक्ट करता है। जैसे अभी लीकर कंपनीज में हम लोग किसी एक एनालिस्ट के साथ हम बात कर रहे थे, तो जनरली आज के 10 साल पहले, 15 साल पहले मैं उनसे बात कर रहा था, मैंने कहा लीकर में तो कई सारी गवर्नमेंट जो है इलेक्शन पीरियड में बैन लगाने की बात करती है। आज जैसे गुजरात में पूरा कंप्लीट लीकर बैन है, फिर उस समय बात चल रही थी बिहार में बैन हो जाएगा। मैंने कहा 1 by 1 अगर हर कंपनी में अगर बैन होता जाएगा स्टेट में, तो देन सेल कैसे बढ़ेगी? तो उनका व्यू बिल्कुल डिफरेंट था। वो बोलते नहीं सर, वो जो है बैन तो हो रहा है, बट आप देखिए पहले लीकर का इस्तेमाल कौन करता था? सेलेक्टिव लोग, कम्युनिटी। उसमें फीमेल ऑलमोस्ट 50% पॉपुलेशन है जो लीकर यूज ही नहीं करती थी, बियर और ये यूज ही नहीं करती थी। तो 50% तो आपका मार्केट वैसे ही आउट हो गया। 50 में सेलेक्टिव कम्युनिटी जो है वो करती थी। नाउ डेज जो अब यंगर जनरेशन आ रही है, तो पहले तो जो मेल डोमिनेंट था, अभी क्या हो गया, मेल और फीमेल सभी ड्रिंक कर रहे हैं। तो लीकर का कंजम्पशन तो दोगुना वैसे ही हो गया। तो इस तरीके से मार्केट कई बार फ्यूचर को बहुत डिस्काउंट करता है, और आने वाले 10 सालों को, 20 सालों को वो एस्टिमेट करने की कोशिश करता है कि आने वाला टाइम किस तरीके से उसको बढ़ रहा है, और उसी के अकॉर्डिंग वो पीई री रेटिंग होती रहती है। तो आई थिंक एक क्वेश्चन हमारे व्यूअर जिग्नेश जी, आपका क्वेश्चन ऑलरेडी कवर कर चुके हैं हम, नायका वर्सेस इन्फोसिस। आई थिंक आपका शायद या तो उस समय कनेक्शन लॉस्ट हो गया होगा। तो आप हमारा जो ये डिस्कशन है ये यूट्यूब पे सीआईआरसी के चैनल पे अपलोड कर दिया जाएगा। आप वहां पे अपने क्वेश्चन का रिप्लाई फिर से सुन सकते हैं। तो सिंस वी हैव our speaker have already replied all the queries, and we have with us time is also 6 o'clock ना। तो now I request अतुल अग्रवाल सर कि जो फॉर्मल वोट ऑफ थैंक्स के लिए आपने सर, निपुण मेहता जी ने बहुत नाइसली एक एक क्वेश्चन सबका जवाब ऑलरेडी दे चुके हैं। तो ओवर टू यू सर, अतुल अग्रवाल सर।
Thank you, Devendra ji, for inviting me for formal vote of thanks. It was really a very wonderful deliberation of Shri Nipun Mehta sir. And as I mentioned day before yesterday also, that I am also learning a lot from this Capital Outlook 2022, the initiative which has been taken by our past chairman and CP committee chairman, C. Devendra Kumar Somani ji. And I'm sure in the time to come, because another 3 days are there where we would be having the same kind of session with the other wonderful speakers. So whatever Shri Nipun Mehta ji has shared here, it was really very useful, and I'm sure the members who must have who were present here into this particular session, they will get the benefit of his deliberation. And I also try to learn how to read the share market, because for me share market is something out of the blue box, and I never understood why the market is going up and why the market is going down, and why this correction is coming up. And at times I have seen like the share market where the company is not doing anything, but still the share price is going up like anything. Because I'll not quote the name, I worked with some listed company in the past from 95 to 99, and during that particular period I have seen the share of a company where the company was working, but the share price was 600 rupees, and within a day the price gone down from 600 to 10 or 20, and the employees within the organization, they book the loss also, huge loss also. So this kind of tendency, because I saw that kind of tendency, and after that I could not make up my mind to enter into the share market. But yes, the learned speakers who are giving the deliberation nowadays, especially on the capital market outlook, that is giving me a good knowledge, and I'm sure our attendees who are present in the deliberation, they must also getting the insight of the share market, and they must be getting the benefit out of it. And I'm sure in the time to come, they won't be going to lose the money if they follow the instructions and the directions and guidance given by the learned speakers in the session. So now I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to CA Shri Nipun Mehta ji for his wonderful deliberation. Would like to extend my sincere gratitude to CA Nilesh Gupta ji, Chairman CARC in absentia, past Chairman C. Devendra Kumar Somani ji, who is managing the session very well, and the attendees who are present here for last 2 hours. And also would like to extend my sincere thanks to the team from Kanpur who are arranging all logistics. With these words, I would like to say stay safe, stay healthy, because Omicron is spreading like anything, and every day we are coming up with the news that there is a weekend lockdown, or this is happening or that is happening. And as it was mentioned by Shri Nipun Mehta ji also in his opening remarks, that in America it is spreading like anything, and maximum numbers were there in America, I believe day before yesterday. So let's keep ourselves safe and use the COVID protocol. We need to use mask, maintain the social distancing, and need to wash hands very regularly.
Thank you.
With these words, once I would like to extend thank you.
अतुल सर, आप जो बता रहे थे 95 से 99 का जो पीरियड, मार्केट बहुत मैच्योर हुआ है और बहुत सारे लॉज एप्लीकेबल हुए हैं और बहुत सारी चीजें।
आई एग्री सर, बट मैं वो बता रहा हूँ कि एक टाइम था तो उसमें इतनी दहशत मेरे अंदर शेयर मार्केट ने बिठा दी थी कि मैंने कभी उधर की तरफ मुड़ने का भी नहीं सोचा।
सर अच्छा किया सर, 2019 तक तो हमारा भी बैलेंस शीट कभी इनकम टैक्स रिटर्न प्रॉफिट नहीं आया था, 2019-20 में ही आने लगा प्रॉफिट।
लेकिन 1 जनवरी 2022 से जो आप सेशन दिलवा रहे हो ना, उसमें थोड़ा मोटिवेट हो रहा हूँ कि अब थोड़ा थोड़ा मुझे भी इन्वेस्ट करना चाहिए मार्केट में, सो दैट अब मैं रिटायरमेंट की एज पर, क्योंकि 8 साल बाद मैं 60 हो जाऊंगा तो मैं रिटायरमेंट की एज पर आ जाऊंगा, तो एटलीस्ट आई विल बी हैविंग सम माय पॉकेट।
सर चार्टर्ड अकाउंटेंट कभी रिटायर नहीं होता सर, जितने
चलिए
बाल
सर,
सफेद होते जाते हैं उतनी फीस का लेवल बढ़ता जाता है।
चलिए चलिए, मतलब अभी मेरा फीस का लेवल नहीं बढ़ा सर, बाल जरूर सफेद हो गए। चलिए,
चलिए सर, ओके, थैंक यू वंस
सर
you
को
very
देख
much.
करके बोल रहे हैं आप जो है,
Thank you.
सर को देख करके बोल रहे हैं आप, सर निपुण मेहता
हाँ
सर
सर, तो सर की फीस 3 गुनी हो जाएगी।
को। सर थैंक यू वेरी मच।
Okay, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for joining us. All the videos are uploaded on CIRC YouTube channel. You can watch there and stay with us for next 3 days also. आप लोगों को बहुत अच्छा लर्निंग एक्सपीरियंस मिलेगा। Thank you very much.